Hi everyone, I'm Maria McLachlan. I often say that the genderists have no arguments, which is why they resort to personal insults and defamation. So a hat tip to the commenter whose name I'm not sure how to pronounce. Is it taln0reich? I'm going to call him Tal, who beneath my video before last, which was the first part of my response to Ilaria Michaelis, he posted a comment that's nearly 1,000 words long and which at least attempts to make some sort of argument. So thank you, Tal. You've given me something very easy to do in exposing the flaws in what you say. For reasons of time, because I am very busy at the moment, I won't cover every single thing he says, but I'll respond to most of it. I said this: our unelected second chamber made the horribly cruel decision to force women prisoners to be forcibly confined with rapists, paedophiles and other violent male criminals who've decided they are women. Tal responds that no one decides to be a trans woman, as gender identity is innate. So Tal believes that even rapists and violent male criminals should be accepted as women because of their claimed gender identity, which, of course, there is no way of verifying. There isn't the remotest possibility that they could just be pretending in order to get transferred to a women's prison. On the prison page of my website, I quote Dr. James Barrett, who was chair of the British Association of Gender Identity Specialists, who said, "It has been rather naively suggested that nobody would seek to pretend transsexual status in prison if this were not actually the case." There are, to those of us who actually interview the prisoners, in fact very many reasons why people might pretend this. Note that I said male criminals decided they are women. I didn't say trans women. Once upon a time, I, along with large swathes of the population, were content to use the term trans women, understanding it to mean that it referred to men who wished they were women, who tried to present as women without actually claiming to be women. Plenty of men who call themselves trans women still fit that profile, but thanks to widespread capture by gender ideology with its oft-repeated and totally empty mantra that trans women are women, the purpose of which is to erase adult human females, aka women, as a sex class with needs that are distinct from those of men, we now have people conflating the two terms, trans women and women. Those captured include political leaders and representatives of every part of the establishment. They pretend it's true because they think that is the side on which their bread is buttered. In the scale of things, women simply don't matter, men do. The upshot is that many of us who were once prepared to use the term trans women and walk that extra mile will no longer do so. Many of us who were prepared to be kind and accommodating will no longer be so. And there is no such thing as a trans woman. And it's not your so-called gender identity that determines what we are, it's biology. I intend to deal with this in greater depth in a forthcoming video, so I'll confine myself to stating the obvious, which is that no man can actually be a woman or vice versa. Next. Tal said, risk assessment exists, so no, a rapist who is a threat to the general population of a woman's prison is not going to get there. How dare you disregard the fact that women prisoners have and continue to be frightened, traumatized and violated by such men. Don't talk about risk assessment, it's bollocks. You can never guarantee a man placed in the female estate isn't going to molest or negatively impact on the mental health of women prisoners. You can never guarantee anybody's safety in prisons, but you can certainly decrease the likelihood and extent of harm to women by not housing male criminals with them. Tal said, trans women are at vastly increased risk in men's prison. Transgender people in prison are exposed to horrific rates of abuse by both staff and their fellow inmates, and I don't doubt that trans-identifying men are at risk in male prisons. they still do not belong in the female estate because they are men. Women are human and not mere shields to be used by some men against others. Is it really too difficult for you to come up with a solution that keeps trans-identifying men safe and which doesn't distress and endanger women, and to campaign for that solution? Or is this, as I suspect, really about validation at all costs to real women? Then he said, isn't it interesting that gender-critical feminists only care about rape in women's prison when they can use that to fearmonger about trans people? What on earth makes you say that? This is the same old victim playing. You don't care about women, you just hate trans people. You really are a piece of work, Tal. Then, not to mention, there is a reason why the likes of you have to keep harping on about the Karen White case, a case where proper procedures weren't followed. And that reason is that the narrative of trans women in women's prison raping inmates en masse just doesn't reflect reality. Basically, the reason why a man guilty of multiple rapes spent 3 months on remand in a women's prison where he raped again and again was because of a new prison policy introduced in 2016, which relaxed the rules regarding eligibility to live in the state of one's choice for trans-identifying men. The trouble with procedures is that it's human beings who make them and human beings who interpret them, and as long as genderists succeed in obscuring the difference between men and women, women will get hurt. As for raping women en masse, this is a straw man, and it is absolutely typical of the gender cult. They cannot refute the claims we are making, so they have to fabricate a claim that nobody has made. Nobody has said trans-identifying men are raping women en masse. We don't need to. Even if it were only Karen White, the whom I didn't mention, by the way, but the reason the likes of me harp on about him is because he is a very high-profile case, widely covered in the media, easy to point to, and the perfect illustration of what can happen as a result of institutional capture by gender ideology. Now, I said, however much they try to dress them up in science, the claims they make are metaphysical. And Tal responded with the usual canard about the brains of trans-identifying people being more like those of people of the sex they wished they were. It's not brain activity that determines whether someone is male or female. I did a video on the trans brain bad argument, and it's really rather good. My favourite comment in response, which I pinned below it, came from a neuroscientist who said, "You are spot on this one. The evidence shows that there are no consistent significant differences between female and male brains except for size, but even if there were, correlation is not causation, obviously. Neuroplasticity, a fancy word for the brain's capacity to change itself upon experience or training, can shape brain's functional networks." That's the first paragraph of a very long comment, well worth the read. The only thing I would add is that this is a red herring, really. It doesn't bloody matter what your brain is doing. Men are typically bigger, stronger, more aggressive and more violent than women. Most violent crime is carried out by men, most sex crimes are carried out by men, and a majority of trans-identifying men are heterosexual. This is why women need some places to be single sex. It really shouldn't be this hard to understand, even for misogynists. The next is in response to when I said, you'd think it boils down to a numbers game. There are many more girls who are distressed and uncomfortable at boys being allowed into their toilets and changing rooms at school than there are boys who claim to be trans and want in there. Tal tells us that it's not a numbers game. Trans girls, by which he means boys who claim to be girls, need to be able to use female spaces in order to be safe from sexual violence. And he quotes an article reporting on some research done by a PhD candidate, but that's irrelevant. I am quite prepared to take this claim at face value and believe that assault of any kind is more likely to happen in a male changing room. It doesn't follow that those males who may be vulnerable should be forced on girls. What about the boy who doesn't claim to be a girl, but who is nevertheless somewhat effeminate and crap at sport? Might he be vulnerable to bullying and assault? Should he be sent to the girls' changing room? The male entitlement in the phrasing here just makes me want to throw up. Again, it's about males using females as shields, regardless of how the females feel about it. Their feelings don't matter, but this time the females in question are schoolgirls and college students. Recently, we learnt that Lia Thomas, the heterosexual male swimmer on the University of Pennsylvania swimming team, regularly exposes himself in the women's changing room. We learnt that many swimmers have complained to the team coach and have basically been told to put up and shut up. What is the difference between any random man going in there and showing his genitals and Lia Thomas doing it? Nothing. It's abuse of women being carried out by a heterosexual male with the complicity of the coach and relevant authorities. And he continues, you might want to watch your blood pressure on this one. While girls' fear of trans-identifying boys is irrational, as trans inclusion does not pose a risk to them. Well, there is some evidence that contradicts that in the form of the 2 sex assaults by this boy at that school in Virginia. But as I have said repeatedly, it's not just about physical danger. It's about how women and girls feel. The trans cultists go on and on about how so-called misgendering and other nonsense is bad because of how the truth makes them feel. Yet girls fearing having boys around when they need to get undressed is irrational because there is supposedly no risk to them. And as for feeling embarrassed or upset, hey, who cares? They're only girls, right? The study he cites, by the way, is not fit for purpose. The methodology is unclear and there is a bunch of standard information missing. But it doesn't even matter because the study neglects to consider the major issue here, which is about dignity, privacy and psychological well-being. He goes on, therefore, trans women's need to be able to use female spaces outweighs transphobic women's desire to force trans women out of them. You mean keep men/boys out of them? Yes, how transphobic not to want to be around men while we're all in various stages of undress. We're such villains. Muppet. Okay, on to the next bit. Recently, some bloke asserted that I couldn't prove that trans-identifying men were a threat to women. I sent him to the crime page on my website, and I haven't heard from him since. Tal said, I don't doubt that you have some collection of trans women who are bad. You could say that. But that doesn't prove anything. Yes, it does. It proves that there are trans-identifying men who are bad. It proves that claiming to be women doesn't make violent, predatory men less so. You seriously think that we should be accepting these men in our single-sex spaces? Seriously? I'll link to that vid below. And Tal said, we don't take away rights from minority groups just because some individuals from said group behave badly. No, of course we don't, but we do take away rights from half the population because members of the other half, the dominant half, many of whom do indeed behave badly, don't give a toss about the safety and well-being of women and girls. Next. The assertion that gender criticalism, I've not heard that one before and I don't know why he puts it in quotes because nobody actually says it. The assertion that gender criticalism would only mean that the person believes that biological sex were immutable and separate from gender identity is fundamentally dishonest. And he goes on to say what he thinks it means, including that trans people should be forced into spaces on the basis of their sex instead of forcing themselves on people of the other sex in their spaces. But no, it isn't fundamentally dishonest to say, as I did, that the core tenet of gender criticism is that woman means adult human female, therefore so-called trans women are men and they don't experience womanhood at all. That isn't what gender criticism only means, but it is the core tenet, and other views flow from it. But not everyone who agrees with the core tenet agrees on everything else. Elsewhere in his comment, Tal says things like, I've seen gender critical feminists saying this and doing that, supporting a conservative saying something, saying trans people should be deported or some such nonsense. You're not grasping, Tal, that we are not a cult. We are individuals who can disagree on a whole range of things, but the one thing we do agree on is that sex is immutable and takes priority over subjective feelings in defining what we are. As for trans people being forced into spaces created for people of the other sex, that is another example of the framing intended to manipulate people into thinking they are victims of some great injustice. No, we are not saying you should be forced to be anything or go anywhere. We are saying, if you're male, keep out of our spaces. You don't belong there. Where you go instead is not our problem. Stop trying to turn us into your oppressors, because we're not. You are the ones oppressing us. Then I said, how can you be a feminist if you buy into gender ideology? And Tal said, by acknowledging that transphobia, homophobia and sexism are all interconnected and directly arising from the complex that is the patriarchal structure of society, in which you are complicit in upholding by spreading transphobic narratives based on patriarchal assumptions. Interconnected how? We get no argument in support of any of the three distinct claims I see made here, so I'm inclined to ignore it. I'm not a mind reader, but I would love to know what patriarchal assumptions he is referring to. That woman means adult human female and entitled to sex-based protections, perhaps? The transphobic narrative of the bathroom predator, which is a myth, blah, 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 only makes sense in the patriarchal image where women are the lower class. Therefore, any man taking on the role of a woman must be doing it out of some abusive motive. It's a myth, is it? Tell that to the 10-year-old girl and the 12-year-old girl who were violated by this dude. Crimes like this are mercifully rare precisely because most public toilets are single-sex and most predatory males, whether they claim to be women or not, aren't as stupid as him in thinking they can get away with it. I've no idea what the rest of Tal's sentence is supposed to mean. I don't think it is seriously proposed that every man who claims to be a woman is doing so with an abusive motive. I mean, nobody's actually said that, have they? What on earth are you talking about? On the other side, trans men are infantilized by transphobic narratives, painted as brainwashed, lost lesbian sisters, and thereby treated as unable to have their own volition. No, they're not. That's just the narrative the cult have decided stands the most chance against the truth, which is that there is a phenomenon called rapid onset gender dysphoria spread by social contagion and affecting girls in huge numbers who, prior to adolescence, had never expressed any unhappiness with their sex. The patriarchal basis in transphobia towards trans men is further apparent in their increased likelihood of corrective rape in order to put them back in their proper place as women. I do know that claiming to be a man does not prevent a woman being raped any more than claiming to be a woman will stop a man from raping women, even ones who identify as men. Funny old world, eh? I don't know whether the reason trans-identifying women get raped is specifically intended to be corrective, and I'm not sure how Tal would know, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me knowing how horrible some men are, which is, after all, why we don't want them in our spaces. This is also perpetuated by gender-critical feminists referencing Alison Bailey's inappropriate and borderline paedophilic comment about breasts that have never known a lover's caress while talking about underage FTMs. That line of the heroic Alison Bailey comes from her keynote speech at the LGB Alliance conference in London last year. I was in the audience when she made it, and it was electrifying. Fortunately, you can see the whole thing on YouTube. I'm just going to show the tiny bit Tal refers to.
Up and down the country and around the world, girls are removing breasts that have never known a lover's caress.
There are many horrific consequences of the dissemination of gender ideology, but the amputation of healthy body parts and other irreversible interventions on young people, female or male, underage or not, is surely the worst. I find it impossible to imagine what it must be like to do this when you're so young, you haven't even had a relationship, and then to regret it. Is it possible to sink any lower than to call Alison's comment, designed to raise awareness in a way that will strike a chord with all decent and humane people, inappropriate and borderline paedophilic? And he doesn't say why he thinks this, because he doesn't think it really. This is one of the cultist tactics to throw out any old shit and hope it sticks. That's why we get called bigots and fascists and white supremacists. It's a bit hard to make any of those stick on a black lesbian feminist, so let's go even lower, hey Tal? I'm skipping the next bit where he again invokes the patriarchy in a manner that suits his purpose, and he mansplains what intersectional feminists should do. Obviously, he's not going to acknowledge that transgenderism is one of the worst forms of the patriarchy because of how it obscures power relations between men and women and turns victims into oppressors and vice versa. Then I said this. Then there is the extraordinary claim that abandoning the proposed amendments to the GRA is devastating for trans-identifying people. How? And Tal responded, because the current process to change the gender in one's birth certificate is so difficult, few have been able to do it, forcing the rest to marry and die under a gender that isn't the one they are, and that is where the birth certificates come into play. Devastating means highly destructive or damaging. An example of devastating is having one's healthy breasts amputated and realising you've made a mistake. Surviving child abuse, then realising you have to share your living quarters with men who've sexually abused children. Finding out that the man you've married and who fathered your children has now decided he's as much of a woman as you are. Not, oh no, my birth certificate tells the truth about what I am. Then he says, the Gender Recognition Act has nothing at all to do with women's spaces or women's quotas / shortlists, so no, women's rights, safety and opportunities are not at risk from a reform of the Gender Recognition Act. Now that is fundamentally dishonest. The proposed reforms of the GRA will mean that a man is legally recognised as a woman if he makes a simple self-declaration that he is, and vice versa. We are already in a situation where it is widely asserted that simply identifying as a woman means being able to access female spaces and opportunities, and we're harassed and abused for objecting. Enshrining gender self-ID in law will make it much harder to challenge. If she really believes that feminists are physically assaulting trans-identifying people in real life, she needs to provide receipts. Tal responded to that with, gender-critical feminists do not have to go out and beat up trans people. Instead, the transphobic rhetoric spread by the likes of you. Transphobic rhetoric? You mean stating truths like sex is immutable and men, whatever they call themselves, are on average bigger and stronger than women, that most violent and sexual crimes are carried out by men, and that claiming to be a woman doesn't stop violent predatory men from being violent and predatory, that women are being cheated out of places on medals podiums by men who claim to be women. That's transphobic rhetoric, is it? Creates a cultural climate where those thuggish men feel empowered to assault trans people and think they can get away with that. Show us your workings. This is just an assertion. Thuggish men have always felt empowered to assault anyone on the slightest excuse, including gender nonconformity, homosexuality, being female. Show us specifically how you think women standing up for our rights have made things worse. I mean, the implied argument here is that if we would only go along with the lie, if we accept any man who says he's a woman as if he is in fact a woman, if we welcome such men into our spaces, ignoring our own discomfort, fear and distress, if we applaud them when they beat real women in sports events, then thuggish men won't feel empowered to assault trans-identifying men, because thuggish men totally care about what feminists think and say, don't they? And I said, how the hell can she see gender-critical arguments as in any way opposed to anti-racism and decolonialism? And Tal said, gender-critical feminism is fundamentally opposed to intersectionality. Oh, don't be so silly. Feminism is about women's liberation, and that means all women. Being gender critical is a key part of feminism because gender, when defined as a social construct that dictates expectations on how people are supposed to be because of our sex, so masculine and feminine, it's regressive. It's a straitjacket that hurts women and men. But being gender critical isn't denying other intersecting forms of oppression based on ethnicity, on sexual orientation, or religion or disability. Some of the most high-profile and active gender-critical feminists are lesbians, and some are black, and some, like Linda Bellos and Allison Bailey, are both. I said, gender critics care about all women, and Tal said, no, gender-critical feminists clearly do not at all care about all women because they, by definition, cannot care about the well-being of trans women. So-called trans women are, by definition, men. If they weren't, they wouldn't be called trans women. And some of them are trying to push back on women's rights. Those ones and all of those who support them are the enemies of women. And the fact that you are dragging out the talking point of transition regret, despite the prevalence of transition regret being extremely low with about 1%. I love it when they refer to scientific papers. The very first line of this one says, there is an unknown percentage of transgender and gender non-conforming individuals who undergo gender affirmation surgeries that experiences regret. Surgeries, right? Of course it's unknown. I recall saying in a previous video that huge numbers of those who've gone through any degree of medical transition and regretted it did not tell their doctors or therapists. Check out the detransition subreddit, which now has nearly 26,000 subscribers. The stories on there are absolutely heartbreaking, but there's plenty of advice about how to come off wrong sex hormones without professional help. And you only have to look at some of the detransition videos right here on YouTube to see what testosterone does to girls. The majority of transitioners don't have surgery, they only take hormones, so they're not even covered by the paper Tal cites, which is a review and meta-analysis of a number of studies in the US about a whole range of cosmetic surgeries undertaken by trans-identifying people, from facial feminization to hysterectomies to genital surgery, and that's where the 1% regret figure comes from. Just that collection of studies. It's not a true reflection of transition regret. I said, How often do we hear genderists making horrible racist analogies between black women and trans-identifying men? And Tal said, the analogy trans women are women just as black women are women does not equate black women with men. It explains that both black women and trans women are subsets with some measure of overlap of the larger set that is women. This is just awful. Black women are not a subset of women. There are no subsets of women. We are all adult human females. So-called trans women are not a subset of women because they are men. I said of the Michaelis article, there was the use of some extremely biased sources to make questionable assertions and the use of very loaded terms. Yeah, not like gender-critical feminists at all, who constantly cherry-pick trans women who are bad in order to paint trans people as a whole as bad and evil and argue against trans people being able to just live their lives. Except that we don't do that, and you cannot point to a single person who has stated or implied that trans people as a whole are bad and evil and who argue against trans people just being able to live their lives. Tal, you have let your emotions get the better of you and are just blatantly lying now. I shouldn't even have to repeat what we are saying, which is that only some men, including some trans-identifying men, are bad. What your deliberate misrepresentation of what we say confirms is that we have given away too much. We should stop talking about trans women and call them what they are, men. If you're seriously going to claim that trans-identifying men are in any significant way distinguishable from other men, good, bad or indifferent, then the onus is on you to convince us. You're not doing a great job so far. Also, very loaded terms, says the person who at every single point used extremely loaded terms towards trans people and trans rights advocates like trans-identified male for trans women, gender ideology just for asking for trans people to exist in society as equals, or calling the movement for trans rights a cult. Now, a loaded term is one with connotations intended to provoke an emotive response and manipulate feelings, like calling J.K. Rowling notorious. The fact that you don't like terms I use doesn't make them loaded. I use the term trans-identifying man when it's necessary to specify that this is a man who either tries to present as a woman or who claims to actually be one. Otherwise, I just call them men. It is accurate and there is nothing loaded about it. I certainly don't use the term gender ideology just for asking for trans people to exist in society as equals. This is typical playbook stuff. Just because we exist, just because we want equal rights. Nobody is saying you shouldn't have equal rights, but you don't just want equal rights. You want an expansion of men's rights at the expense of women. This trans-identifying man put it succinctly. As a transsexual, not only do I have the same rights as everyone else in the UK, I also have the advantage of 25 years of male privilege, and in my experience in academia, institutions bend over backwards to pander to trans women, usually at the expense of women. I use the term gender ideology to refer to your absurd idea that it is your gender identity that determines whether you're a man or a woman or neither, or it changes on different days, and every idea that follows on from that. I don't mind not calling it an ideology, but what else do we call it for short? We're talking about a set of interconnecting beliefs and ideas. That's what an ideology is, so why do you object to the term? That's just silly. Cult is just an insult, and one you deserve for your inhumane, irrational, self-interested and uniformly stupid assertions. Don't want to be called a cultist? Stop behaving like one. And finally, I said, I am not one of the persuadables. And Tal said, Correct, you are not one of the people who can be persuaded to not be a transphobic bigot. It's not a good thing to be proud to not be a persuadable, because that means that you are saying that there aren't any argument that could convince you that you are wrong. No, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that. You are deliberately decontextualizing what I said to make your preferred narrative work, which is very dishonest, but what's new? I am persuaded by sound reasoning and evidence. You don't have any. That is how I was persuaded to change my mind and stop pretending that trans-identifying men are virtually the same as women. The context here is very specific. It was about this document, which described itself as a messaging guide, and it's full of advice on how to use language to fool people into thinking that transgenderism is on a par with race. It, too, is deeply dishonest and quite sinister, actually. It calls its targets persuadables, and yes, I am proud of having developed the critical thinking skills to be able to see right through it, which, of course, makes me a terrible transphobic bigot in your nasty worldview. So that's it. In spite of the time and effort Tal put into writing his response, he ends up coming across as just another misogynist getting his hate and resentment of women off his chest. What's his endgame? Does he think I or anyone reading his comment is going to be persuaded by his incisive analysis? Does he think he's going to guilt trip me into shutting up or even switching sides? Of course not. Tal has, I think, proved a perfect illustration of how deeply flawed gender ideology is. It amounts to an assertion that our sexed bodies are fundamentally irrelevant in determining whether we are men or women. Manhood and womanhood are reduced to ideas and performances, and raising objections that are based on real life and demonstrable experiences of hurt and harm are denied, dismissed, and gets you called a transphobic bigot. That's how to win over hearts and minds, not. Thanks for watching. Bye.